A Dog's Life, The Autobiography of a Stray, by Anne M. Martin, published by Scholastic Press. Bad Dogs. I didn't want a new home. I wanted the shed. I wanted Mother. I wanted the garbage heap. I wanted Yellow Man and the mice and Matthias. I wanted Bone and me curled up on our burlap nest. When Bone had walked away from our shed that morning, I hadn't thought about why. Was it to escape a place he felt was dangerous? Was it to search for a safe new home? I wouldn't have left, but Bone had chosen to. Maybe he had a reason, maybe not. It didn't matter, because here were George and Marcy carrying us to their house, and they were making the choices now. Marcy unlocked the door to our new home. The house was smaller than the Marians and bigger than the little one at the edge of the field, but with hardly any space between it and the house on the other side. And all along the road were houses, houses, and more houses, each with a flat yard in front, planted with spindly trees. Marcy opened the door, stepped into a cool, dark room, and placed me on the floor. "There you go," she said to me. "Let's get you cleaned up." I licked at the foam around my mouth as George carried Bone inside and set him on the floor next to me. I looked miserably at Bone. My stomach was sloshing around like the stream we had played in, and I needed to pee. In our shed home, we were careful not to pee in our nest. We rarely even peed in the shed. So I stopped delicately off of the rug Bone and I were standing on, squatted, and peed on the floor by the door. "Hey!" shouted George. "Bad dog! Bad dog! Stop that!" He grabbed me up, pee dribbling from between my legs, shoved the front door open, and tossed me onto the steps. From inside, I could hear Bone let out a high-pitched, angry bark, and Marcy say, "George, calm down." I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do out there on the steps. I had finished peeing, and I wanted to get away from George and Marcy, but Bone was still in the house. So I sat trembling before the door until Marcy opened it and brought me inside again. "Now look here," she said, as she herded Bone and me into a large room with a table in the center and no rug on the floor. "You can't pee indoors. Do you understand? No peeing." "Marcy, for heaven's sakes, they don't know what you're saying," George called. He was in the other room, swishing a rag over the puddle I had made. "And they're not housebroken. I hope you realize that. They're not housebroken. Do you really want the job of housebreaking two puppies?" "How difficult can it be?" Marcy called back to him. "They're young. This is when you're supposed to teach them." She looked down and saw Bone lifting his leg against a wooden chair, saw me pooping in a corner of the room, and quietly squatted each of us on our bottoms. Then she hissed, "Bad dogs," in a voice not loud enough for George to hear, and cleaned up our messes quickly. Bone and I retreated under the table and hid among a maze of chair legs. After Marcy had finished cleaning up, she said, "Okay, supper time," and fished under the table for us. Bone let out a long, low growl while I backed away from her. "Go ahead, growl if you want," said Marcy, wounded. She stood up. "You'll come out when I offer you food." "What are you going to feed 'em?" asked George. He entered the room with a fistful of soggy paper towels. Marcy was opening and closing cabinets. "Well, I'll get them some dog food tomorrow. For now they can eat—" I didn't hear what Marcy was going to suggest, because at that moment George lifted the lid on a garbage pail, and Bone shot out from under the table, knocked the pail over, and pounced on the food scraps. I forgot about my misery when I smelled all those familiar odors. Eggs and bologna and cookie crumbs and apple peelings. I forgot about my stomach, too. I was hungry. I was starving. And here was another garbage heap. I snatched at a piece of turkey, and Bone whisked a stale piece of bread, a whole piece, under the table and ate it in big gulps, growling all the while. "No, no, no!" George shouted. "Marcy, will you look at this mess?" Marcy yanked the can upright and tried to gather the spilled garbage into a heap, while Bone and I kept darting out from under the table to grab at more bits of food. "No!" Marcy yelled again and again. "Bad dogs!" Bone and I didn't settle down until we were full of food scraps. Then we fell asleep under the table. I knew that at some point Marcy slid my brother and me out from under the table. She did this gently, saying, "Ooh, tired puppies, look how sleepy you are." I knew she and George sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, Bone in her lap, I in George's. I knew these things, and Bone knew these things, but after our day of traveling we were suddenly so tired we couldn't even open our eyes. Tired puppies. Marcy murmured again, stroking Bones' back. George stroked my back, and now his hand, the one that had flung me out the door, felt more like Matthias's. "How old do you think they are?" Marcy whispered to George. George continued stroking my back. "I don't know. They must be several months old at least. I don't think they're babies. Maybe 5 months." "Still pretty young," said Marcy. "We'll have to get them to the vet soon. We don't even know if they're boys or girls." She paused. "I wonder what they're doing on their own." "They're probably feral, George replied. "I don't think they've lived with people before." I fell sound asleep then. I didn't waken until I felt myself being lifted up and carried somewhere. I opened my eyes and found that George and Marcy were settling Bone and me in a large box in that room with no rug. The box was lined with newspapers. "This will be your bed tonight," said Marcy. She patted us on our heads. "Tomorrow we'll get you something better. Good night, puppies." The room went dark, and I could hear footsteps trail up and away from us. For a long time I tried to nestle into Bone, to curl into him and pretend we were safely tucked in our burlap bed. But I needed to pee, and I missed the rustling of the mice and the soft sighs and mews of Yellow Man and the cats. I listened hard for anything familiar, for owls or even coyotes. I thought I heard some faint cricket songs, but that was all. I edged away from Bone. I had to pee desperately now, but I didn't want to go in our bed. Bone was restless too, and probably needed to pee just as desperately as I did. I let out a whimper. Bone let out a louder whimper. I whined, and then Bone started to howl. I joined him, and we howled and cried until suddenly the room grew bright, and there stood Marcy, her hands on her hips. "What on earth is wrong?" she exclaimed. "For heaven's sake, be quiet, puppies." Bone and I stood up, resting our front feet against the side of the box. We jumped and yipped and whimpered. Marcy glanced over her shoulder. "It is 2 o'clock in the morning," she said fiercely. "Please, you have to be quiet." My bladder was about to burst. I barked sharply. "Okay, that does it." Marcy dragged the box out of the room, down a short hallway, and into a small space. "If you can't be quiet, you'll have to spend the night here in the laundry room." I heard a click. The room became dark, and Marcy left, slamming the door behind her. Bone and I cried some more, and then I finally peed in a corner of our box. Bone peed where I had peed. Now our box was wet and it was smelly, but we were exhausted again, so at last we fell asleep. When Bone and I lived in the shed, we woke slowly each morning as the rays of the sun crept through the windows and lightened our home. When I awoke in the laundry room, I had no idea whether morning had come. The room was as black as midnight. I sat up in our stinky box and poked my nose into Bone. He whimpered and turned over. I heard a noise then, a small thump, and Marcy opened the door. "Morning, puppies," she whispered. "I see you finally settled down." Marcy reached into the box and was stroking me when Bone woke suddenly, saw the large hand on his sister's back, darted forward, and bit the hand. "Ow! Stop it!" cried Marcy. She slapped Bone across his nose and stood up fast. Bone yelped. "Marcy, what is it?" called George. "The tan puppy just bit me." George appeared in the doorway. "Okay, that does it. Those puppies go today. We don't need this, Marcy." No, please, just give them one more chance." George scowled. "Forget it." "No, really, one more chance." George shook his head. Bone and I didn't know what another chance was, but if we had, we wouldn't have wanted it. In any case, we lost the chance. The moment Marcy carried us very gingerly back to the room where we had eaten our dinner of stolen scraps, Bone squirmed out of her grasp, tore across the floor to another pail of garbage, wrestled it over, and began tossing bits of food to me. Marcy looked helplessly at George and said, "I have to leave for work now." "Great, so this is my mess to clean up?" "I'm sorry, I can't help it. Never mind, just go." Marcy looked at Bone and me, started to say something, then turned and left the room. As soon as my brother and I had stopped growling and eating, George stuffed us into a carton, smaller than the one we had spent the night in, tossed the carton onto the front seat of the car, started the engine with a roar, and drove away very fast. The Throwaways. George drove so fast that when he turned corners I could hear the car squeal, and Bone and I would tumble against the side of the box. My heart began to pound. I panted and licked my lips and tried to ignore the rolling in my stomach. Every now and then I could hear George mutter things like "blasted dogs," or "what was Marcy thinking," or "ought to have her head examined." The car turned another corner, and this time I could feel the box slide across the seat and into George's side. He whacked it with the flat of his hand, catching Bone's jaw from the other side and causing him to yelp. "Shut up, you little pills," said George loudly, and he whacked the box again, this time knocking me in the head. I was too stunned to help. The whack sent me flying into a corner of the box, and I huddled there silently. Presently the car slowed down. I could hear sounds from George's side of the seat, but I couldn't see what he was doing. After a moment our box was opened roughly, and then I watched as George, sweating, yanked Bone up by the scruff of his neck and tossed him through the open window of the car. No sooner had Bone disappeared from sight than George grabbed me up in the same manner, threw me out the window, gunned the engine of his car, and sped away. Bone landed hard, his snout smashing against pavement, and he couldn't help letting out another cry of pain. I landed a little distance away from him on my shoulder, and I heard a sharp crack, but again I was too stunned to yelp. After a moment I tried to stand, though. I staggered up on my hind legs first, then onto my uninjured front leg. But when I put weight on the other leg, it gave way, and I sank down again. I looked at Bone. He was limping toward me, his nose bloody, and he had almost reached me when I heard someone cry, "Did you see that? Some guy threw those puppies out of a car." "Are they all right?" asked someone else. I glanced around. Bone and I had landed on asphalt like the Marion's Lane, only this piece of asphalt was much, much bigger, and cars were lined up on it as far as I could see. Ahead of me was a row of buildings which people kept hurrying in and out of. The people who had spotted Bone and me were two women, their arms loaded with heavy bags. They ran to us now, set the bags on the asphalt, and knelt down. "I think they're going to be okay," said one. "Look how cute this one is," said the other, motioning to Bone. "The tan one. I always wanted a puppy. I'm going to take it home." "What about the spotted one?" "Well, I don't think I could manage two dogs, and that one isn't as cute. I'll just take this one." "And leave the other one here?" "It'll be all right. Someone else will come along and find it. That's why they were dumped at the mall, you know." The women gathered up their bags and walked off with a struggling, squirming Bone, wiping his nose with a Kleenex as they went. Bone was gone. I was separated from my brother. I tried to run after the women, but I couldn't keep up with them. The pain in my shoulder made me sit down. I tipped my head back and let out a long, low howl. For a while I rested on the asphalt, but it was sticky and hot and hard against my rump, and I didn't like sitting among so many cars. Tentatively I stood up, keeping my injured leg off the ground. I found that I could move around on three legs, and I made my way off the asphalt to the shade of a tree on a little spit of grass with a lamp-post planted in it. I rested again for a while, dozed off, and when I awoke, I tried standing on all fours. It hurt, but I could do it. I could walk on my injured leg, too. I was thirsty, so I looked around for a brook or a stream. I didn't see either one, but I found a puddle at the edge of the asphalt and had a drink from that. Mother had taught Bone and me to be wary of people, but I was also wary of cars now, and with so many of them around I was afraid to move. I returned to the trees and made myself very still and small under it. All afternoon I watched people and cars come and go. No one noticed me. The light began to fade, and I felt chilly. I was used to cuddling up with Bone for warmth, and now he was gone. I sidled over to the tree and tried cuddling up among its roots, but they were cool and rough and unyielding. I sat up and found that I was shivering. For a while, shaking, I watched the cars. I noticed that more were leaving than were arriving. The asphalt was becoming emptier and emptier. I noticed the quiet, too. At midday, with the sun high in the sky, the air had been filled with voices, the rustle of bags, the blare of car horns, and music floating through the open windows of some of those cars. Now I heard only occasional quiet voices as people left the row of buildings and drove away. By the time darkness fell, just a few cars were left, the asphalt stretching away from me like a great black pond. And still I sat shivering under the tree. I was cold, I was tired, my shoulder ached, and I was hungry. I was very, very hungry. With a sigh, wondering where Bone was, wondering where Mother was, I took another drink from the puddle. Mother was truly gone. I felt sure of that. Something had happened, and she had died. That was the only reason she would have left Bone and me when we were so young. But Bone could be somewhere nearby. Maybe he had a home with the woman with all the bags. Maybe he didn't. After all, our first home with the people hadn't worked out. Maybe Bone had escaped from the woman and was looking for me right now. Maybe he was trying to make his way back to this place where we had been thrown away. I should wait for Bone, I thought, but I couldn't stay here. The water in the puddle wouldn't last, and I needed food. I looked all around me, straining my eyes to notice any movement, and saw the last car drive away. I sniffed the air. I smelled exhaust, car tires, the soles of people's shoes, squirrel, mouse, insect, something like mouse but not exactly mouse, dog pee, not mine, and something sweet. I sat up as tall as I could and stretched my nose as high as it would go. Sniff, sniff, sniff. Was that garbage I smelled? Cautiously I stepped away from the tree, stepped off the spit of grass, and began to cross the asphalt. Garbage was my best chance for a meal. I followed my nose in and out of the pools of light from the lamp posts. Sniff, sniff, sniff. I came to a bit of hamburger bun and snapped it up. I came to a paper cup lying on its side and lapped up the white liquid that had run out of it. I came to some crunchy yellow bits and tasted them, salty. This was fine, but I knew I smelled more garbage. Garbage like the Marions' garbage heap, real garbage. I found it behind the buildings where the people had been going in and out of. A whole row of garbage cans. Most of the lids were fastened tightly, but one can had been tipped over and its lid had popped off. Dinner! I dove into the can and was rooting through it. Had just caught the scent of turkey when I heard a low growl behind me. I backed out of the can, and without even turning to see what was growling, I ran. I ran and ran across the empty stretch of asphalt, in and out of the lamplight, past puddles, past tempting mouthfuls of food. I ran until the asphalt ended, and I crossed a stretch of grass. Then I screeched to a stop. Before me was a line of whizzing, whooshing cars, all with two bright eyes shining on their fronts, and I remembered Bone and the busy road the day before. Panting, I glanced over my shoulder. I saw no growling thing, but I wasn't eager to turn back. I looked at the cars again. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. This road was different from the other one, though. It wasn't busy all the time. Cars would speed by, then the street would become dark and silent. No cars, then whoosh, whoosh, whoosh again. I waited. The next time the whooshing stopped and I couldn't see any car eyes, I tore across the road. On the other side I found more grass, and then I found trees, lots of trees, a little woods. When I turned around and peered through the trees, I could just make out the eyes on the cars. When I looked in the other direction, I saw only woods. I could have been behind the Marions' house. I made my way through the darkness, listening to familiar sounds, to crickets, to the small chirpings of birds, to a pair of owls calling to each other. I fell asleep that night on a nest of dry leaves, my stomach mostly empty, my mouth dry, my shoulder throbbing. I wished for our old bed in the wheelbarrow, wished for Bone, wished to hear Mother's heartbeat.